Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Richard Kearney. Dr. Kearney holds the Charles B. Seelig Chair of Philosophy at Boston College and has served as a visiting professor at the University College Dublin, the University of Paris Sorbonne, the Australian Catholic University, and the University of Nice. He's the author of over 24 books on European philosophy and literature, including 2 novels and a volume of poetry, and has edited or co-edited 21 more. Dr. Kearney, so happy to have you here today.
A pleasure to be with you.
And today we're going to talk about your newest book, which is Touch, obviously by yourself. And kind of the guiding question I thought we would go through is, how has our dive into the digital space affected our sense of touch? And what are the consequences for the human experience? So, again, happy to have you. If you don't mind giving us what made you think of this question in particular? And again, pleasure to have you on.
Well, I think one of the reasons this became an urgent question for me was I was witnessing in my classes as I teach, the younger generations coming up, and just in the social world around me, the culture here in North America. I actually, was born and grew up in Ireland and then studied in Paris and Canada, but I've been living here in the United States, in Boston for the last 21 years. And have been very aware, living here, but it's true of the entire world now, that the digital has become such a huge factor in our lives and in the way in which we communicate with each other. And this was, of course, accentuated in the recent COVID crisis, which has not yet left us, alas. We're struggling through, but we learned an awful lot, I think, about just how important the digital is for us as a civilization to communicate with each other through distance when we are, for example, not able to do so in person because of COVID infection and contagion. So we became extremely aware that we could nonetheless go through our silver screens and our technical screens, our touch screens, literally, with the touch of a finger. And this is the curious paradox of the digital, that in fact, our digital universe is now virtual. But we do talk of a touch screen, which ironically enables us to move beyond our tactile bodies and relate to others in a virtual, simulated way. And yet digital also carries the sense not just of a code, a communication code, a cyber code, but our fingers.
Yes.
And that is the irony. We touch the touch screen to escape from touch, if you like, or to transcend touch.
Yeah.
And so I think in this experience of that paradox, we also became aware not just of how wonderful it is to be able to use this medium of communication, digital technology, but also of what we've lost in terms of leaving our bodies behind us, our real lived bodily experience behind us. And this again became very evident during COVID, when we missed hugging people, we missed proximity, whether it be in a concert stadium, a football stadium, a pub, a restaurant, any kind of public setting, a schoolroom in my case, all my communications with students was through virtual communication, through Canvas, through Zoom, and so on and so forth. So as Joni Mitchell said in her famous 1968 song, I think it was, "You don't know what you've got till it's gone." And when we lost touch with touch, we became aware of just how important touch is, and we saw this very dramatically and tragically. In those scenes where people were dying and were not able to be with their loved ones, and they reached out to touch and be touched, and it was the caretakers and the doctors who bore witness to this, and it was very, very painful for loved ones not to be with those in person, with tactile presence, just holding their hands when they died of COVID. So the first thing we do when we're born is we touch and we are touched. The child reaches out to be touched. And the last thing we do when we die is to reach out to be touched. So it is a touch hunger phenomenon that we became acutely aware of over the last 2 years.
Absolutely. And we even see that reflected in with COVID. There was that constant discussion of the cost of lockdown, right? It's not just that we also lost people to, and I can't remember the specific term, but basically deaths of depression because they were cut off from the outside world. And it's a very similar thing. You've mentioned it a couple times here, that whole phenomenon of touching and being touched. The idea that, you mentioned Aristotle said touch is the foundation of all the senses. I would love for you to talk a little bit about the other and the way that touch, because you can see without being seen, but you cannot touch without being touched. How does that figure into our experience of the other? I think you even call it maybe the fundamental or the most important experience of the other in your book.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'd be happy to go into that. Just before I do, I want to pick up on something you said a moment ago about depression.
Yeah.
And this, of course, will lead into the importance of touch. But it is a phenomenon observed, by the way, statistically, well before COVID, that the more time people spend, particularly the younger generations, online, the more solitary they become.
Yes.
And the more they suffer from depression.
Yes.
So here again, touch hunger comes into play, because the more hyper-connected we are digitally in terms of digital codes, the more solitary, isolated, and anguished we become at the level of our digital connections in terms of body-to-body contact.
Yeah.
And this is an extraordinary phenomenon that technology overcomes distance, but it doesn't bring nearness. And that is one of the great paradoxes and perplexities of our digital civilization. I mean, I think the answer, and I argue for this in the book, is both senses of the digital. I mean, we need digital technology. There's no way we should renounce that and go back to some, pasture land, pre-enlightenment, pre-industrial.
You're not a Luddite.
No, I am not. We need to keep our technology in one hand, but our touch alive, our tactile sensitivity in the other. And here we come back to your question, a broader question about touch bringing us into contact with the other. So let me go back to the beginning of the Western philosophy of touch with Aristotle, as you rightly say, and to some extent in a dispute with Plato, the two great founders of Greek Western philosophy. And Aristotle says in his first book of human psychology, certainly in our Western civilization, the De Anima was called, On the Soul, he points out that touch is the most fundamental of our senses, because basically it brings us into contact with the other person, but other living beings, other sentient beings. It can also be the animal universe and so on. Because you can see without being seen, as you mentioned. You can hear without being heard. You can taste without being tasted, but you cannot touch without being touchable. Touched or touchable, tangible. So there is a nakedness and a vulnerability and a hypersensitivity about our tactile being. Skin is our largest organ. It's a wraparound organ, apart from hair and our nails. It covers our entire body, 2 square meters, in fact, an average adult. And as such, we cover up, of course, for all kinds of necessary reasons. But the basic vulnerability remains. And that vulnerability for Aristotle was a good thing, because it kept us open to otherness. You could look and never be seen by anybody else, at least in theory. In fact, it was one of the fantasies of a Platonic figure called Gyges, that you could become all-powerful if you wore a certain magic ring and suddenly you became invisible, but you could see everybody else. And this, of course, is what's permitted also with our digital media.
Yeah.
We can see others without being seen. I mean, we can live in a world of games, video games and movies and social media and whatnot, and never actually be seen. I mean, pornography is an obvious case in terms of sexuality. Everything can go through the optical fantasy, but there is no two-way process. You are seeing but not being seen. So it's the reversibility, the recursivity, the reciprocity of touching and being touched, which for Aristotle made us sensitive beings, and as such alert to and attuned to other people, and therefore more philosophical, because we are questioning ourselves and not remaining within ourselves, which sight allows. So in that sense, he says it is our most philosophical sense, our most intelligent sense, because we're constantly open to surprise, to something happening to us rather than us controlling and mastering everything that happens out there, turning everybody else into an object. And that's where Aristotle differed from Plato, because Plato defined the human as anthropos, hence our word anthropology. And anthropos means the one who reaches up, who looks up, anthropos. And of course, for Plato, that meant standing up on our own 2 feet, so to speak, and reaching up with our eyes towards the heavens. And that made us intelligent, according to Plato, transcending our quadruped existence with other sentient beings, which for Plato was kind of hazardous. Our tactile bodies were hazardous because we were constantly vulnerable to the material pressures of the world. But through sight, we could have this mastery. And this led eventually to Descartes' famous statement, as he sort of inaugurated modern Western philosophy with the "I think, therefore I am." He could have said "I see, therefore I am."
Yeah,
it amounts to the same thing. That we become masters and possessors of nature, and that we did. We lived in, since Plato through Descartes, right down into our own 21st century, and the digital civilization technology accentuates this. We live in a universe where we're in charge and nature has become an object. And we've seen with the climate crisis exactly how dangerous that optocentric worldview has become. We have turned nature into an object to our own, or in terms of our own mastery, subject to us.
Absolutely. And I actually had written down here to ask you about the question concerning technology, because it does seem pretty obvious, even as we're talking about the climate crisis, that when Heidegger talks about us squaring things off to fit that, to enframe them, to fit them into the way we see things, it's much easier to see something and recognize a shape inside it and cut off the rough corners. Whereas if you're touching something, like, the rough corners are always there. They're all like something I wanted to make sure I'm tracking with you when, and I think it's in his Politics, I could be wrong, but Aristotle talks about man as a fundamentally social animal. Do you think that's part of the reason that definition kind of connects with his dispute with Plato? The fact that man is inherently a social animal, and that is a touch-oriented thing?
Yes. You can be a solipsist, that is to say, alone in your ivory tower, solus ipse from the Latin, living in your own little ivory tower, fantasy world, without seeing anybody else. In fact, some people, I read something in the Guardian newspaper, somebody was saying, I like COVID because I don't want to be in constant contact with other bodies, Yeah. I like my own world, and I'm quite sufficient in my digital universe. I mean, we even have Facebook now under its new reinvented guise, Meta, sort of promising us the ability one day to create our own sort of fantasies, simulated selves, an android, an avatar, a cyborg. That will be our own digital clone. And in that instance, we will be free from disease, certainly free from other human beings if we don't want to, because we have our own perfectly, what's the word I'm looking for? Immaculate world, pure and pristine and not vulnerable to the vicissitudes and contingencies of material, messy existence. So, yes, I think Aristotle knew that because we are tactile and tangible beings, subject to this reciprocity principle of touching and being touched, we are social animals. And it's very interesting during COVID how therapy through touch became actually so important. And I don't just mean, deep tissue massage and so on. That was very important too. And doctors made it very clear, Dr. Meniel in Paris, for example, that all his patients should be touched where possible.
Yeah.
And this is not just in relation to COVID. It's in relation to dying. It's in relation to disease. People who, if you shake somebody's hand before you operate on them surgically, they will heal better afterwards. I mean, it's
really?
A very basic point. Yes.
Huh.
It creates a rapport with the healer. My brother is a heart surgeon working in Ireland, and he has observed this. But it's also been, clinically verified that forms of person-to-person contact and communication prior to and subsequent to surgical intervention greatly increase the rate of recovery. And at a very basic level, physiologically, touch, it lowers our blood pressure. It lowers cortisol, the stress levels. It alleviates anxiety, helps with sleep and digestion. Just basic physiological facts and factors that are so crucial.
And so it sounds interesting that you've mentioned this a couple. I love the way that this conversation kind of ebbs and flows and goes around. I'm a devout Christian and Presbyterian, and so when you talk about the term excarnation versus incarnation, I assume that's kind of. I wanted to know, where did you get the term excarnation? And as we talk about this loss of, you're talking about the the ivory tower, excuse me.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's people, like when people talk about becoming a cyborg, in many ways they're talking about fully inhabiting the digital space, and they're becoming excarnate. Yes. Where did that term come from, and what are the consequences of our excarnation?
Yeah, in fact, the term came from my teacher in Montreal in the late 70s, Charles Taylor, who uses it, used it in his classes, but also in his book, The Age of Modernity. And basically what he means, and that's the meaning that I take up, is an alternative to the incarnate universe. So excarnation is the opposite of incarnation. And incarnation for Taylor is for me, as for you, I gather, it does have a Christian ring. I too have a Christian formation. So I took very seriously at a religious level, but I take Aristotle seriously at a philosophical level, who argues for incarnation or embodied social existence in the world with other people through our tactile and tangible relationships. And by the way, that can also include, just want to mention this in parentheses before going back to Christianity, that this includes at a social level being touched by people. You don't literally have to be in physical proximity, though we usually mean that. But our colloquial phrases of being touched by somebody or finding something touching is a way in which our bodies, our emotions, our feelings are in fact animated and altered by our relationships to other people. So sometimes the most touching form of touch can be to not touch. There are appropriate forms of touch and not touching, but the body still remains tactile. I mean, we're still picking up vibrations from the other person's physical presence, even though we may not be, literally touching the person. We are, by proxy, in touch with the person. And to be in real communication is to be touched by somebody and to find what they say or do touching. So I just wanted to mention that in relation to Aristotle, that touching and being touched is the essence of our being as intelligent, sensitive beings. To be sensitive is to be intelligent. Okay, so it's not about reading books. It's actually about a sensitivity at the level of our skins. So, when you say of somebody they're thin-skinned, you mean they're sensitive. Yeah. And therefore they're more likely to, as Aristotle puts it, discern differences. Touch knows differences, he says. At a basic level, that's the child who, hot and cold, hostile and inhospitable, the flesh of the mother, the breast, whatever. I mean, at a very early level, we start making distinctions and between presence and absence and so on. So touch knows differences because we are in contact with the human other. Okay, let's go from Aristotle then, the ABC of Aristotle and touch, to Christianity, which makes a similar point in relation to another tradition, the Abrahamic, Hebraic, Judeo-Christian, whatever you want to call it, Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. And that is based on revelation. And in Christianity, as you well know, PJ, that comes with the Incarnation, that the Word became flesh. So the beginning of Christianity as a religion is an act of incarnation.
Right.
Which is the opposite of excarnation. But we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Because there has been a temptation, even within Christianity, to deny that radical message and to go for a more Platonic excarnate notion of the soul versus the body, of the spirit versus the senses, and so on, which is actually a betrayal of the true integrity of Christianity, which is that the Word becomes flesh.
Yeah.
It still remains Word, but it becomes flesh. Christ is flesh. Christ is also in relation to the Father and the Spirit. I mean, that's the mystery of the Trinity. So there's always the flesh becoming more than itself, moving toward, I must go so that the Spirit can come. But the Spirit comes, the Paraclete comes again and again as flesh, as the stranger who as Matthew 25 makes clear, gives or receives a cup of cold water. Giving and receiving bread and water and wine to our fellow humans is an act of constant, what I call anacarnation. That is to say, the incarnate Christ coming back again and again and again, as he promises to do in Matthew 25. In the least of these, the person literally there who shares food and water with you. And usually we think of that as the other, the stranger, those say to Christ, but we didn't know, we didn't recognize you. And he says, I was the stranger. Hospes, he repeats the word, hence the root of our word hospitality, hospes. I was the stranger. You didn't recognize me, but I was the stranger. So anyway, but back to the life of Christ. If you think about it, okay, the first act of Christianity is the incarnation, the emptying of divinity, kenosis, into human flesh. And so Christ is born in a stable with animals. If you think about it, it's very tactile and tangible. Yes. The least of these. He's born as a stranger in an inn. There's no room for him in the inns of Bethlehem. So he ends up in a stable with animals, and animals are very important. Christ begins with an animals breathing on him. I mean, as we see from our Christmas cribs, there is the child Jesus surrounded by animals, and he ends his days on a donkey. Palm Sunday, riding into Jerusalem. So there is that extraordinary identification with animals, although Christianity has not been great for much of its history in acknowledging our rapport with the animal universe. In fact, Buddhism and some of the Eastern religions have been much better at that. The Hindus have, monkey gods and elephant gods and so on. And Buddhists believe in the sacredness of all sentient beings. Now, that is true of Christianity also. But apart from some rare exceptions after Christ, like Francis of Assisi and others, who St. Kevin in Ireland, who befriended animals and the natural universe. Hildegard of Bingen in Germany, for example, the greening of all things, viriditas, of nature. But for long periods of time, Christianity was very Platonic. It was dualist of spirit and soul versus the body, and therefore led to a very, very I would say, pathological view, in fact, of sexuality, for instance, which we see nowadays tragically and scandalously revealed in child abuse, in France and Ireland, Canada. Every day you open the newspaper, you realize that certain religions, because they have practiced a form of Puritanism, basically, it used to be Victorian Puritanism and Jansenism, but it led to this view. Women can't be priests in certain churches, and you can't get married, and sexuality is forbidden. Chastity is the only way, and of course that led to the opposite. I mean, it's one of the ironies that pornography and Puritanism share this in common. They both are excarnate experiences. They both take us away from the flesh.
Yeah.
And that leads to, I think, perverse human behaviors.
Yeah.
And, not just in the churches, but also, in our entertainment industry, as the Me Too movement reminded us, there is good touch and bad touch. And one of the reasons why there has been so much bad touch, so to speak, perverse touch, abusive touch, manipulative touch, is because we have not been incarnate beings. We have been excarnate beings, living at a distance from ourselves, living outside of ourselves, living in an alienated fashion to our own bodies. So then the body becomes manipulable. It's not us, it's a thing. It's an object, it's an instrument. And that's one of the great dangers. And just back to Christianity again for a moment. I mean, I have a chapter on Christ, and working through his various miracles that, as I say, he begins and ends with animals, and he begins and ends his mission and ministry with an act of sharing food.
Yeah.
When he's 30, he changes the water into wine at the marriage feast of Cana. So it's a marriage, it's a sharing of food and wine. And he ends his time at the Last Supper, again sharing food. And when he's resurrected, what does he do? First thing, he comes to the disciples on Lake Galilee and says, come and have breakfast. He prepares food for them.
Yeah.
When he appears to them in the inner room, he says, have you any fish to eat? And then at Emmaus with the two disciples, they break bread. They recognize him, not in what he says, not in what he looks like, by the way. They do not recognize him optically. They recognize him tactilely in the sharing of the food.
Yeah.
And Christ's mission from the age of 30 to 33 was constantly what? Touching people in order to heal them. It's extraordinary. If you look at the miracles of healing, they're about touching. 90% of them involve him taking the young girl's hand, putting his, finger into the ear of the deaf person, placing his hand on the shoulder or being touched by, say, the woman with the hemorrhaging, the bleed. I mean, she touches the hem of his garment, but it's through touch that she's healed. So Christ is constantly incarnate as a tangible, tactile being, touching and being touched. And that's not a purely materialist statement. It is a spiritual statement. Touch is spiritual as much as it is physical.
It's really, even as you mentioned that, the example that comes to mind, and I'm still walking through all the ramifications of him making mud and putting it on the blind man's eyes, which is, and everything you've said here from the Christian perspective is pulled out of the Old Testament, right? Like the idea of the Word becoming flesh, I mean, that is rooted in the idea that God created everything and said it was good.
Yes.
And that insight, just like you said, the temptation to become Platonic and say material is bad, but again, we see the Christian church return to. I mean, that's not what Genesis says. So yes, I definitely feel like I'm tracking with you. Go ahead. No, but I totally agreed. The good news, so to speak, about the incarnation doesn't begin with the life of Christ. Absolutely precedes for Christians, the Old Testament and the Torah and the Talmud. The body is absolutely essential, and the body is good. Yeah. As you say in Genesis, 6 days of creation, and on the seventh, Yahweh, the Creator, Yahweh, says it is good. And that includes all the animals, not just the humans, obviously, but all the animals and all the living creatures, that crawl in the bottom of the sea. It is good. All of it is good. Not that we cannot introduce evil into the world, but it is good as created. And that includes the body. And so the incarnational message begins with Genesis. Yeah. There are two incarnations. The first is the creation of the world in Genesis, and the second, for Christians, is Christianity. But even within Judaism, the Hebrew Bible, again and again, touch is important. I mean, when Jacob, receives the word of God, the name of Israel, it is after he has wrestled, hand to hand combat, with God, the dark stranger in the night. Yeah. And he limps ever after. He carries the limp of the mark of that contact, that physical, tactile contact with God. So it's kind of a remarkable thing just how incarnate
the two testaments are. And I have some Islamic scholars who are working on Islamic readings of touch and so on. And they have reminded me, I mean, I've been very ignorant of the Islamic tradition, but of the importance, for example, of sharing food in the Hajj, the annual ritual of hospitality. It's all about the sharing of food. So I think it's throughout the Abrahamic traditions, but certainly in terms of, my own Christian upbringing and formation, I was very, very moved by this emphasis constantly on healing through touch that Christ represented. And just if I might add another word on animals.
Absolutely.
Because I do think Christians haven't been great in terms of their relationship to animals. And I think this is a certain forgetfulness of how Christ opens us to all sentient beings. I mean, curiously enough, even with the Syrophoenician woman, when she comes and asks for the healing of her daughter, and she says, look, you're feeding the dog, would you treat me as well as you treat the dog?
Yeah.
And you're giving crumbs to the dog, and Jesus says, your faith has made you. And again, it's the identification with the animal who supposedly is the least of all creatures, but in fact is capable of being healed, so to speak, of bringing healing. And during COVID, many people sought animal therapy with horses, dolphins, dogs, because if you think of it in terms of horses, they're nearly all skin. They have hoofs and manes, but apart from that, they're hyper alert, and they're herd animals. Coming back to Aristotle and the social, our social being. I mean, horses are herd animals. They don't prey on any other animal. They don't eat meat. They don't kill what they eat. They're herbivorous, and they're hyper attuned, hypersensitive. That's why you can actually ride a horse with the tip of your finger. They are so sensitive, and why they spook easily, because they're aware of danger, from a mile off or 20 miles off. They have this hypersensitivity, and dolphins likewise are all skin. And were very therapeutic, not just for, in COVID, that the need became accentuated then, but autistic people, clinically depressed people have found great healing. And dogs, of course, pets, were huge, just to have some living thing to touch.
Absolutely.
And to be touched by. So that's part of our response, I think, to the climate crisis, is a new relationship to the animal world and the sentient living world around us, which is not necessarily human. We've been very anthropocentric. Being optocentric, that is I-centered, EYE, has also led to an anthropocentric universe. And we need to realize that we are not just, masters of the universe. We are guests on this earth, and the earth hosts us. Until we realize that we are touched by the earth as much as we touch it, we're going to remain in deep trouble.
And I think there's a segue here to, I really loved your discussion of taste as we talk about touch senses difference, right? So we look at, going back to what we were talking about, the Abrahamic tradition, you have Abraham welcoming the strangers. And what does that involve? That involves food. And then even you mentioned Jesus turning water into wine. I think something that correlates with what you were talking about in your book that's very interesting is it's not just that he turned it into wine. It's not just for drinking. He turned it into the best wine. So the taste matters too, like sensing the differences and the better quality. So when we talk about even synesthesia, those sorts of things, can you talk a little bit about how touch relates to taste, and especially in the creation of discretion and prudence, sensing difference, and even I feel like our loss of practical wisdom in today's culture?
Yeah. And it's very interesting, by the way, in COVID, that one of the first senses to go, I mean, we weren't allowed touch, of course, social distancing and all that, but was taste. People lost their taste.
Yeah, it was a little ironic. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, this is one of the frightening things about, a pandemic virus like that it can deprive us of our two most basic human senses and vital senses, which for Plato were the lowest, but which for Aristotle and Christianity in a different tradition were, I think, arguably the highest. But yeah, let's say a little bit about taste then. Glad you picked up on that. Well, there's two different kinds of tastes. There's taste which is unilateral. That is to say, you consume things through taste. So Aristotle defines this as gluttony. It's one of the vices.
Right.
Good taste is when touch comes into play. It's therefore tactful taste.
Yes.
Tact coming from touch. What we would call true taste, good taste, and that is discerning. So it's when you eat, not just take the example of eating, since we're talking here about
Absolutely.
Food and Abraham sharing food with the strangers, Christ sharing food with his disciples, and so on, and us all sharing food. Thanksgiving, Christmas, whatever feast we have.
Yes.
Hanukkah, the Hajj, whatever tradition we come from, we share food. And in that instance, ceremony is very important, where we allow our taste to become tactful. So, for instance, in certain religious traditions, you would have, grace before meals. You would pray and give thanks to the harvest and the harvesters, to the animals who provided the meat or the fish or whatever. And this is very important, that instead of just consuming, we actually taste. And this is where, to be, in the French term, to have good taste, and Aristotle actually says this, those who are connoisseurs of wines and good dishes. Now, we arguably don't want to be elitist here. Not everybody can afford good wines and good dishes, but everybody can eat in a thankful, sensitive, discerning way, where you appreciate and are attentive to what you are eating. And of course, in the Eucharistic ceremonies, this is huge, because it's actually the body of God that you're talking about, and this is very fundamental to many traditions. Other traditions, it's not necessarily, the Christ figure. In Mexican religions, animist religions, it was mushrooms. It can be different things that you're tasting. The first word for God in Sanskrit in Hinduism was Anna, food. So, but it's not food that you consume gluttonously in a one-way fashion. It's a two-way, reciprocal process, and that's where taste becomes tactful. And interestingly, our word for being intelligent in our relations with other people and things is savvy, to have savvy. And where does that come from, savvy, our word savvy? To be kind of knowing and discerning in our relationship to others, which means actually to be tactful. It comes from savoir, to know, which comes from savourer, to savor, which comes from sapientia, the Greek Latin root, sapientia, sapere, which means to taste. Wisdom was to taste. It's an extraordinary thing. Sapere comes from savourer, savourer, savor, savvy.
Yeah.
So it's a very fundamental thing that's carried in our everyday language. Yes.
Is that where Homo sapiens comes from as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
Anyways, Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens means, obviously, we translate it as the rational man, but actually it's the tasting or tasteful man. That's what it means. The sensitive, tasteful, tactful, savvy human being is Homo sapiens. But we've lost that tactful taste by turning everything or so much into consumption and consumerism, where it's a unilateral, one-way devouring of commodities, food as a commodity. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting you talk about that. This is a discussion that happens in my household. The American attitude towards food is not healthy, like as a general rule, and even as people try to become healthier by losing weight, one of the ways that they try to solve it is thinking of food as fuel. And I actually think that's a step further in the wrong direction, even if you can solve, you're losing in many ways what it means to be human. And instead of eating with thankfulness, which I think is a better answer, and savoring what you have, sorry, you're making me like reevaluate some of the things that in my own life I'm like, okay, food doesn't always have to be special, and that's kind of the answer, because like when we treat ourselves with ice cream, But I think that's because we have the overages of things like sugar and fat and all that sort of thing is a rejection of taste, and it's a focus on commodity. And so what we do is we distort our taste. And so what we, instead of returning to food as fuel, what we should do is return to moderation and focusing on a taste that's in line with what true health is.
That's a very good way of putting it, and very Aristotelian, actually. He goes for the middle way, what he calls the golden mean, because Aristotle, although he doesn't make this precise point, it's a very good one you're making, PJ, but it would go something like this. Overeating and undereating are both forms of alimentary abuse. We're using food in both instances. In the first instance, gourmandise is just to fill ourselves up and satisfy ourselves, but by dulling the senses, in fact, because overeating dulls your senses.
Yes.
And this constant need to be filled and refilled again and again, like a car. You know, you got to go to the gas station, you got to go to the supermarket. The fridge has to be full. But under eating, even to the point of anorexia, and God knows that can be a very sad and tragic situation for people. But it's still food being utilized in terms of almost being weaponized.
Yes.
In terms of overeating, in terms of expenditure, wealth, sort of indulgence, gluttony, avarice, and in the case of undereating, it too can be a manipulation of the body to fit into a certain image, which sometimes, can be fed by social media, as we know. The hyper thin, almost, it's hard to pristine, Peter Pan body, whatever.
Yeah,
it's almost excarnate. It's a movement towards excarnation.
Well, it is our excarnate because it's photo edited. Like they're not real. They're not real people. Sorry, go ahead.
Correct. Yeah, no, but that's absolutely right. And in anorexia and those who suffer from, and it can be a form of addiction, you see.
Yes.
It can be a very sad thing. Just as food, overeating, bulimia, and undereating are forms of addiction. But yes, it's very often living according to a certain psychic optical image of what you should be. Because if you say to somebody who's anorexic, they say, I feel, why aren't you eating? I'm too fat. And you say, but you're not fat. You're so thin. But they don't see themselves as thin.
Yeah.
They're actually caught in this cropped image of themselves, which sometimes is fed to them virtually.
Yes.
Through the entertainment industry or whatever, social media, intentionally or otherwise. But it is an example of where food can be abused, in our digital communication universe.
Absolutely. One thing I definitely wanted to touch on, I just did an interview with a friend of mine who grew up in Cambodia. She was a missionary kid, grew up, when she was 5, she moved from the U.S. to Cambodia. And so we talked about what it meant to be a third culture kid. And you talked about, in the West, we're very problem and fixing problem oriented, right? Solution oriented. And that can be really good for medicine. But where we do fail, and forgive me for the length of this question, but we fail to abide with people when we can't fix the problem. We fail to abide with prolonged chronic terminal pain. And so I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this. But so my friend, everyone lived together. It was very communal, right? The digital space at that time has now become more prevalent in Cambodia, but at the time it wasn't. Obviously, they got electricity, I think, like 4 or 5 years before she got there. So the digital world is just catching up. So they had a sudden death in one of the families, and the mother came out. She lost her daughter, and she was just screaming, and everyone came from the neighborhood and just sat around her. She tried to hurt herself, and they stopped her. But other than that, she went in and she grabbed every piece of glassware she had in the house, and she threw it against a tree. And just said, I've been forsaken by Buddha, by my ancestors. And everyone just sat, like the whole neighborhood just sat and watched in silence, just making sure she didn't hurt herself. But they let her smash everything, and they just sat with her. No one said anything. And to me, that's a completely alien experience. Is that something, is that connected in any way to like this whole optical versus touch discussion?
Well, I think it does. And I mean, something I talk about in the book when I do get to, psychiatry and psychotherapy and medicine, I draw very much from the Greek tradition, which of course is still alive in our medical practices in the West to this day. I mean, we talked a lot about the Judeo-Christian and biblical Christian, stories of touch and healing. But in the Greek tradition, in the Greco-Roman tradition, there is what's called the Asclepian tradition, which comes from Asclepius, who was one of the two founding fathers of Western medicine. There was Hippocrates, hence we have the Hippocratic Oath, and that was about management of pain and curing of pain. It was sort of a curing model, and we need that, God knows.
Yeah.
You have a disease, you want surgery, you want intervention management. And then there was the Asclepian, which was a different approach, and both were compatible, of course, and in fact complementary. And that was not about fixing through a cure, but being with the person in their pain. And it was presupposed that if you were to be an Asclepian healer, you would be a wounded healer. So Asclepius himself was wounded. So he could recognize wounds in others. And so he healed them through touch, through ceremonies of bathing and incubation, herbal remedies, and contact with animals also. Even in the dreams, Asclepius would appear as a cock or as a serpent or as an animal, a horse. And so it was kind of an integral return to our body and a suffering with others so that you could have a healing, even if there could not be a curing. That you would, you would help the other person to live their woundedness. One of the implications being we're all wounded at birth. We're wounded, and we carry wounds within us. Every separation from the womb, from the family, from loved ones, and so on. Life is about learning to live with separation, and then reconnection. So the Asclepian tradition, where people were healed by being with each other in a very embodied, ritualistic way, was very important. And a lot of what's called alternative medicine today is actually recognizing that, whether it's psilocybin in terms of healing depression, or massage therapy, deep tissue massage therapy, herbal medicine, which is huge now, coming back again and again, and a certain recognition of indigenous traditions in that regard. Yoga, breathing, meditation, getting back in touch with one's feelings and the body and so on. That's all very Asclepian. So it comes back to your Cambodian situation where you abide with the person in their pain. And by sharing the pain, a certain healing comes, even if they cannot be cured. So I think that's very important, because we live in a cure culture where, the temptation is to reduce everything to imaging. Even the technology of surgery now can be done, through all kinds of lasers and microscopes and scans, and that's hugely important. But we must never forget, in the Hippocratic management, technological management of pain and insurance companies and everything that involves, we must never forget the moment of what was called in the past the bedside manner, where the healer, the doctor, would be there taking the case history of the person and attending to them in terms of a presence. And very often, the handshake or whatever it happens to be. My brother, who works in palliative care, I mentioned that earlier, he has argued very much, I cite him indeed in the book, for the importance of tactile Asclepian healing for those who are dying. Because you can't cure death. But you can heal people of their death anxieties, of their panic and their fear, because that's even worse. The psychic pain of fear is even worse than, or certainly as bad as very often as the physical pain, which can be treated and should and must be treated, with painkillers. But there's the psychic pain.
Yeah.
that can only be treated in this Asclepian fashion of being with, and that's a very tangible, tactile experience.
And it has physical repercussions, right?
Yes.
Even though it's psychic, it has physical repercussions because of that fundamental connection.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, Levi-Strauss, the great anthropologist of the 20th century, gives an example of this, where he's working not in Cambodia this time, but he's working in Brazil, in the Amazon jungle, and he comes across a community where they have and he works with them. He does field work with them, and they have a practice which he describes, where this woman is dying. She's bleeding to death. She's trying to give birth to a child. It's blocked in the birth canal, and so she's bleeding to death. And the community come together and they sit around her in this little hut, and they share a story together as they hold her hand and her feet. They tell a story about a hapless victim caught in a cave, and there's a monster outside, and they all recite the story, including the woman who's dying of hemorrhaging. She's hemorrhaging to death, and they tell the story of how this victim then escapes from the cave and overcomes the monster. And at that moment, the young pregnant woman gives birth to the child. And he says, "How is this?" He says, "It's mind over matter. It's actually sharing together a story and the emotive catharsis of that story. It's affect that actually then allows the body to relax to such an extent the fear goes, the blood pressure goes down, cortisol, is lessened. And because of that muscle memory of a story of liberation, which they share together, it actually works. A miracle happens and the child is born. So it's another example, of how the Asclepian tradition of being with somebody, sharing a story, taking time with them, when no surgical intervention was possible, because there they were in the middle of an Amazonian jungle. But being with the person, in this case, with sort of a touching narrative, so to speak, a shared myth of the liberation of a victim from a monster, the monster here being pain and disease, can bring about an extraordinary healing. And I think that's how Christ worked, by the way. I mean, it's how the Greek healers worked. Christ was a wounded healer as well.
Yeah.
And he was the crucified one, and he was the forsaken one, and so on. It's because of Christ's wounds and the assumption of his wounds that he was able to be a healer and continue to be a healer.
Absolutely. That's really interesting and very kind of inspiring. It's so different from the way that we would ever approach things in our culture, in a developed culture.
And yet it's there,
Yeah.
It has been kept, even if it's been sort of marginalized and kept under tabs. But people, funnily enough, maybe we lost it in our mainstream philosophy and theology and our church sort of ecclesiology.
Yeah.
But I think simple people lived it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
At all kinds of levels. The way they shared food, the way they prayed, the way they healed each other. It went on. I think the witch hunting, actually, literally the witch hunting, when they got rid of that sort of almost nature Christianity, in particularly Europe, but here in New England as well,
Yeah.
And herbal medicines were practiced. Until suddenly they were associated with the witches, and the witches were heretics because nature was distrusted.
Yeah.
And we're just kind of getting back to that now in many respects, a return to sort of a greater, more trusting, tactile relationship with nature in terms of this reciprocity principle. So at all levels, it operates at the level of medicine, it operates at the level of daily culture, it operates at the level of the way we eat, the way we pray, and certainly the way we relate to the universe. How are we going to drive cars? How are we going to heat our houses? These are really practical questions.
Yes.
and as we see, in terms of the decisions going on in Glasgow, we've reached a crisis point. We have to change our ways.
Yeah.
and we have to be touched by the message,
Yeah.
touched by nature again, the pain of nature. We have to feel the pain of nature.
Yeah.
Even if it's feeling the pain in our own bodies because of flooding and conflagrations and food shortage and war and migration. I mean, it's there's a lot of pain out there.
Yes.
And we have to feel it. We have to be touched by it if we're going to change our ways.
Absolutely. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, but I did maybe just to wrap things up, because one, it's kind of the main question we started with, but I also think it was the impetus for your book, and it's one of the bigger chapters. Leaving it open-ended, can you talk about how the internet specifically, what do you think are the key important issues at stake with excarnation and incarnation in the internet?
Well, it's a complex question, and it's one where I learn a lot from my students, actually, because I don't, spend much time, gaming and so on. But I'm aware, of course, I teach through the internet, and during COVID, all my classes were online. So I'm aware of all the advantages and all the pleasure, the magic that the internet can provide, and the connectivity, which is itself very important. We can know what's going on in other parts of the world and get all kinds of news feeds, which can make us conscious of how others live. So all that is good. The danger is, and I have a chapter on this, that we become, to repeat what we said earlier, excarnate, that we live too much time. I mean, I did a poll with my students the other day, sort of a straw poll, and it was between 6 and 8 hours of their day is spent on either iPhones or computers, but they're living virtually. Yeah. And then they sleep maybe for 7 or 8 hours. So they're in their imaginary world there too, dream world, but they're not sort of attuned to other people as tactile, tangible presences in their world, as reciprocal relations. Because when we're dreaming, we're not reciprocally relating to other people. And when we're on the internet, we're not reciprocally relating to other people. So that's the danger of isolationism growing from hyper-connectivity. Now, it is interesting that in a lot of, or at least some of the new experiments in digital technology, some of the digital engineers are becoming aware of the necessity to try and introduce some level of reciprocity into the media. Yeah. And that's where haptic technology comes in. And I mention that in the conclusion to the book when I talk about COVID and sort of some of the new developments in haptic technology, which enable people to have long distance hugs, for example, that you could put on a vest and actually experience being hugged.
Really?
So it wasn't just optical. Yes, there was an actual hugging taking place. And there are experiments of again, wearing certain headsets and vests where you can, for instance, was a tree experiment done in this regard, VR, where you can see the trees and smell the leaves and the flowers and the bud, and then feel the actual branches and bough swaying. So I mean, we're into kind of an almost sci-fi world here, but it's happening. That the digital technology that has been so optocentric to date is recognizing the need, where possible, to open out to the other senses. And this is very important because we need touch to be in all of the senses. I mean, you mentioned the word synesthesia earlier, which means, for those, it's a bit of a technical term, the crossing of the senses. And we need to bring touch back into sight. We need to bring touch back into taste, as we mentioned earlier, to turn it into a sort of a gourmet discernment and sensitivity to food rather than a devouring consumption. And same with smell, that flair is that sort of native savvy we have when it comes to our olfactory experience. And very, very important. I mean, in certain animals where smell is very important. So smell and taste. And in all of them, we need the reciprocity principle at work. And I do think that we need to keep a dialogue going, a very creative, collaborative dialogue between the digital as our tactile fingertip and, which is our unique identifying point, even on a passport, right? Our fingerprint, the most sensitive part of our being on the one hand, and then the digital code that opens up this virtual world of hyperconnectivity on the other hand. It's a both and. It's not an either or, because if it becomes an either or, we're back into Platonism.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're sort of saying, spirit, virtual world versus physical, tangible, embodied world, and that's the danger.
Yes.
We've got to keep the two in a creative dialogue. And I do think, and this is something I argue in the penultimate chapter of the book, that a lot of movies, I mentioned Ex Machina, Black Mirror series, Westworld series, Her, some great movies and TV series that where the digital technology, the digital entertainment media is itself becoming self-questioning.
Yes.
And is showing the absence of touch in our culture, in our digital culture. So it's the digital imaginary itself that is reflecting on itself, critiquing itself, and reaching out towards touch.
Yeah.
A bit like Yahweh and Adam, in the Sistine Chapel in Michelangelo's beautiful painting, reaching out finger to finger. The two digits, the virtual coming from the skies, and then the human coming from the body, the Adam or Adamic body, and that's the kind of touching of the two digital media that we need, the body and the internet.
Thank you so much. And it's always sometimes when these discussions come up, it can be very pessimistic, but I love how you end on a really positive note and with a solution and a move forward. Thank you for coming in today. Thank you for talking about your book, Touch. I think it's pretty obvious what the title of the book is from this discussion. We'll have a link to that in down below. But Dr. Kearney, real pleasure. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. And let me just say, as you end on that hopeful note, we probably have the scientists tell us, 30, 40, maybe 50 if we're lucky, years to go on this planet if we don't do something radical. So it's very important to get back in touch with touch if we're going to keep going.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you. Been a great pleasure. Bye-bye.